All right, people. Next episode of Talkin Thrones here tonight. Season 2, Episode 4, entitled The Garden of Bones. Pat, I think you had a little bit of an interesting non sequitur for this one, considering that for the second time, the title of the episode is related to your absolute favorite storyline in this whole season.
Hey, I wonder if all the Talking TV fans understand that this is the garden of uninteresting storylines that Dany is entering into. It grows, right? You know, isn't that what the phrase is?
It doesn't need grow. It doesn't need grow with every person that is left outside by the Carthines. But all of that and more on tonight's episode of Talkin Thrones.
So Dany recognizes her soldier has a new horse, right? That's it. Oh, you got a brand new horse. What's that from? Oh, it's Carf, you say. Let's go. Let's go. And then the next scene is, you won't let me in?
Damn.
You won't let me in?
Oh my god.
Oh, I'll let you in.
Back up. Back up.
No, Dany's over. We just talked we just talked over the whole scene.
Look, I mean, I think it's safe to say that, like, at this stage of the journey, every Game of Thrones head kind of knows that, like, this Dany storyline this season, in season 2, book 2 with Clash of Kings, is kind of the worst. It's just awful. She's just wandering around the desert, and then she gets stuck in a city, and she's there for the whole time, and then at the end, her dragons breathe fire at a creepy-looking warlock, and she has some visions of the future that give people at the end an excuse to be like, hey, I was watching the show the whole time, and then she locks some people in a safe, and then she leaves. Like,
you know what I will applaud though is, like, you know, when the new horse comes up and the rider is like smiling and happy, the wardrobe, you know, for Dany and the rest of the gang is like the perfect dystopic, like, we're totally ruined, we're not going to survive. You know, it's all in tatters. It's really beautiful. That wardrobe.
It may have been better for Westeros if, like, if they ended up continuing that direction, just ended up wandering around the desert for all of eternity.
Yeah, I don't know. They kind of look like the ragtag group from, like, Newsies, or maybe
kind
like
kind of look like an off-brand Mad Max crew that didn't get any of the technology.
Maybe, yeah, they're just waiting for whatchamacallit, Mel Gibson to come by and say
that might prove to be slightly more problematic. But people, this is season 2, episode 4, episode 14 overall of our Talkin Thrones series right here. We're talking about this episode, which is entitled The Garden of Bones. First time director and writer, we have David Petrarca, who would direct this episode and the next episode, and we have Vanessa Taylor, who would write 3 episodes for the show. This episode 6, The Old Gods and the New, and then episode 2 of season 3, Dark Wings, Dark Words. She's also an Academy Award nominated writer who was nominated recently for co-writing The Shape of Water with Guillermo del Toro. So she's definitely been around a lot. Well, what I will say about this episode before we get started is that it once again is playing off of the last episode as far as there's a lot of action that's going on. It's juggling a lot. But there's also a lot of instances where it kind of steeps into, like, expository territory. Case number 1 being, as we just got out of the way, because, like, it's the worst part of these first couple. Like, it's the worst part of the season, but it's also the worst part of this first couple episodes. It's just Daenerys wandering around. The first episode, we just see she's got dragons. She sends off her riders. The second episode, one rider comes back without a head, or rather, the horse comes back without a body, and the head's in the pouch. And then the handmaid says something about him not being able to go to the Nightlands, and that was the title for that episode. And this episode, she finally arrives at Qarth. She's received by the 13, which are the kind of the merchant council that oversees them. And finally, we actually get some interest when Zarazo and Doxos, who's a member of the 13, enacts some policy that happens in all of these medieval movies where he slices open his hand. What is it, Pat, about slicing open your hand that just shows, like, yeah, I'm serious, you know? Like, I always wondered that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it does in this case. It's just like, I'm going to gash my hand, like, okay, really I guess it's one of those world building things that we don't have to understand.
Maybe.
And you know what I'm going to be looking for is the next couple episodes. I'm going to be looking to see if the scar is still there or if it's instantly healed.
You know what it is? He's probably going to have his in the back of his head facing the screen the entire time, so you're never going to be able to see it. And that's probably
it's possible, but I'll be looking for it.
I'll be looking for it. I know you will be. And now that you put me onto it, I'm going to be looking for it too. But she gets received by them. She at first says no because they're like, yeah, we want to see the dragons. Like, so we've heard a lot about dragons, but we want like some visual proof. And she's like, I'm tired, and I'm not going to show you the dragons. I'm like, okay, that's smart. Whatever. And then they, of course, leave. They're about to go back inside, and Zarazon Doxus is like, okay, they can come in because I'm going to slice my hand. That's about it. That's literally all the Daenerys does.
But where are the dragons? Like, there's only like 15 of them, and like they had clear.
They're being held in that one
luggage.
cage. They're being held in that one cage. Basically, it's like it wasn't even like they even had to take it out of the cage. They literally just had to like throw up the burlap sack, and that was it.
Yeah. Why doesn't one of the merchants just be like, "Is it that cage over there?" You know, like. I think that's the dragons. Just take the cloth off, you know.
Oh,
I don't know. It's one of those storylines where watching this season again, you know, it's it's a very slow storyline. It's a very short storyline. Yeah, it's not like the most bang for your buck, so to speak, storyline that there is. But you know, I think it's really important for her character because once again she's at ground zero. And she's meeting these new people who basically have the best of her. And she's going to, you know, sort of come into her own and realize, like, no, it's with these dragons, I have power. You know, so it's, you know, before it was sort of, you know, she had power as a, you know, Khaleesi. And now this storyline's about her getting power as the mother of dragons. And, really so it's a nice small little arc that basically is... you know, stands in the shadow of Tyrion and his, you know, basically exploits.
Right. Season 2 is primarily Tyrion, right? And even though, again, Jon and Dany are listed as the main characters, right? This is still in kind of like their early phase. They're learning more progressively, but they're still very much parked in the side, right? Because their storylines are also so far removed from everything that's going on in the main action that they can kind of keep it away. You know, you kicked off Jon's last couple episodes that he was, you know, dealing with Craster and everything up north, and you got Dany's. Now you got Dany, everything going on over here in Qarth. And then you continue with Jon and the Wildlings next season and Dany conquering the slave cities. And, like, progressively, it's interesting how Martin keeps these characters so far outside of the action that by the time they do and are ready to come into the action, they've already kind of had fully formed journeys on their own. So even though it seems like nothing's really happening in the moment for Daenerys, long-term, definitely, you can definitely tell this is a story that's going to make a difference. Because, again, it's kind of, she learns crucial lessons here just about, like, kind of ownership and, like, kind of, like what the price of depending on certain people is here exactly. And kind of, you know, this is really her first example, you know, because she's primarily been with the Dothraki before this, and now she's like in a merchant city, and she's beginning to understand the idea of commerce, you know, and the idea of like having to make deals with people that you don't like all of that. It's very interesting how the seeds are still being sown, even if it's unfortunately kind of a case in a storyline that is a little bit stretched out for its own good, because the whole thing is that there's so much else that's happening in this season. Like, there is so much that happens within these first 4 episodes alone. It's kind of insane how much. It still surprises me every single time I watch it.
Yeah, like we're seeing Joffrey become a young budding torturer.
Yeah,
you know, like right in front of our eyes. You know, what does he do? He basically with Sansa, you know.
Well, so it takes. We gotta take one scene.
Well, yeah. Okay, so the opening of the episode. Yeah, so the opening you're right.
So the opening of the episode basically sets us up for this kind of torture sequence that comes in, which is where Robb's camp. We have this little funny scene with these Lannister guards, who are eventually all killed as Robb attacks one of them.
Dom, I don't think any scene that involves like fart humor as the center of the story is really a great scene, but you know. Having the wolf attack someone was pretty awesome.
That made it all satisfying, because I'm like, oh man, Benioff and Weiss are better than this. They gotta go to a fart joke, really? That's what they're doing here. But yeah, so it ends up, of course, we see the aftermath. It pulls another classic early Game of Thrones move where we only see the aftermath of the battle. We see Robb Stark wandering around the battlefield, and we get another new character introduction to another character that is definitely gonna be Robb's ally in the near future, Roose Bolton. You know, him and Robb are having a debate over what to do with the prisoners. Bolton suggesting that they torture prisoners. Robb's kind of reminding him, like, okay, you know, this kind of torture was forbidden in the North. And then, of course, he meets the next
Oh yeah,
installment in his journey towards death.
Bolton's has this great line, right? Where it's like
Yes.
a naked man tells no lies, or something like that, and then
Yeah,
but
it's like a naked man tells no lies, but a flayed man has none, or something like that.
Yeah, it's really like we should go back and get the exact quote, but like,
Yeah, right.
Oh
Pretty
man,
damn good quote.
that really is a great introduction to who Bolton is. As a character, it's like, oh man, he torture is his thing, which should be a little bit of a hint here.
Yeah.
Bolton, Joffrey, they both like their torture time.
Indeed. Yeah, and even though this scene is primarily used as another exposition set up in order to launch us into the next scene, we still get introduced to Talisa Mygear, who this is the first, I believe, instance in which we see this, what's it called, we've seen this happen a couple times going forward throughout the show, but this is, I believe, the first instance in which a character is completely changed from the books. Like, completely different name, completely different character, because the character that Robb Stark ends up marrying in place of the Frey, that caused him to break his vow with the phrase that we saw made last season, this season is in the books is a character named Jane Westerling, who is a member of a house called the Westerling House. That's a small house, basically, because he took a wound at this battle in the crag, and Jane Westerling helped nurse him back to health. And the whole thing about the Westerlings is it's very ambiguous about, because they're a Westerosi family, it's very ambiguous about where their loyalty lies. What's it called? They claim to be, for Robb, but there's also like allusions that like the father's family member might suggest that they are actually secretly still in debt to Tywin, right? And there's potentially, suggestions that this family takes a part in the betrayal of Robb and Cat at the Red Wedding, in addition to the Boltons and the Freys. But in the show, it is completely replaced by just their go-to, again, because, again, they saw it work so well for Shae, so they're like, screw it, we'll just do it for Robb, too, which is where they have this beautiful, kind of, mysterious, foreign beauty, that being the character of Talisa Mygear from Volantis, who is just a healer, who is just, once again, there to kind of, throw in the moral gray area and kind of, show Robb, it's like, hey, it doesn't matter whose side you're on, what justice you're kind of doing. At the end of the day, it's all just people. It's all just meat, and then all of your causes are meaningless. But like, I wanted to get your take on that. Like, why do you think this changed? Why do you think this changed?
Well, in like 20 years, when they have a kid, and the kid's asking, "How'd you meet?" Oh, I was in the middle of amputating, a teenager's foot, and he came over.
Man came over.
Yeah, he swaggered over.
And I told him what's what.
Yeah, but for the most part, I would say that it's a great scene. The two of them are basically throwing back some personal philosophy, and it ends with, Robb saying, "Hey, this kid is lucky you were here," and then she quickly retorts like, "But he was unlucky that you were here." Right. And so it's one of those things where she doesn't let it go. She tells him exactly the situation, and that he should not forget exactly what he did to these people, even though they're sort of Lannister men. Even in this scene, she says, like, 6 months ago, they threw a spear in his hand, and that's probably the first time it was ever in this person's hands. And so it's the reality of war that Robb can't forget, and that's really what she brings up when they first meet. Right,
and I guess kind of my interest in this scene, right, because they introduce her as a character that is supposed to be kind of like, supposed to open Robb's eyes as far as, what their war is actually accomplishing versus what he thinks it's accomplishing. But I guess my problem with this whole character and how they phrase it is that with knowing where it's going as far as with the decision for the Red Wedding, she ultimately becomes yet another plot device, because she is literally only there to kind of seduce Robb into like kind of changing his way of thinking for the war, so much so that he's willing to break his vow to the Freys and essentially all get them to where the Red Wedding ends up, And I guess just it's another situation like Shae, where it's like, but in a way kind of more egregious, because at the very least with Shae, like, that character portrayal, like, it actually, does hurt, even if I think that, kind of the personification in the show versus the books is a little bit, off. But I don't know, I just can't help but feel like the version of this character that they have in the books, with her kind of being this, what's it called, somebody who they're not quite sure is on their side or not, but Robb is kind of forced to enact this, what he considers this honorable act, because where she helped heal him, and as a result, he kind of feels obliged to marry her. Like, I don't know. Like, what's kind of your whole take on that?
I think there's a couple of characters like Shay and Talisa. There we are. And Talisa and even Roz. Like, Roz is another character that, started in season 1, is sort of like having a fling with Theon, decides to move down to King's Landing, becomes a really good employee for Littlefinger, Lord Baelish. And then she gets into this whole Joffrey storyline that we're about to talk about, and gets really trapped in the middle of the war between Cersei and Tyrion. And Roz's character is also very plot device driven. It's like, let's bring her up whenever we need a character to sort of be at that level, that very like trying to climb up the ladder, but really no one's letting that progress. You can only get to a certain point. And it's becomes a plot device, in terms of who Roz is as a character. And I think that happens with a lot of these side characters. They're just sort of, hey, like Pycelle, it's like, just bring him up whenever we need a good joke, someone to be slapped around, and or someone to sort of give some what was it, like diarrhea medicine he was given to Tyrion or something like that. So it's like there are these sort of characters that are just there that do have a big impact on the main characters, but they're just really support. And it's quite clear that the writers of the show really are they know who their support characters are, and they know what they're there for, and they're very economical about them. So I think Talisa is one of those characters where it's like, you just need to give the audience enough, to like her. And then it's like, oh, of course Robb wants to hook up and marry her.
Right.
And then obviously the Red Wedding is
a coming. The Red Wedding is a coming. Yeah, we still gotta get past Blackwater first, but yeah, we will definitely get into that as we talk about that the rest of the episode. But yeah, it's definitely another one of those things where it's like, again, I try not to harp on this too much as a book reader, but like every time I see that, I'm always like, huh, like what? Because like I said, it's one of those things where it's like when a plot device character kind of becomes obvious versus like, okay, they kind of actually did serve a purpose in the books, even if their purpose was eventually to die. But
yeah, it sounds interesting, the way you put it in the books, and if I had read the books, maybe I'd have more of an opinion. But
the whole thing about the Jane Westerling character from the books is that it's all from Kat's point of view, because Robb is not a focus character in the book, so we're all seeing the entire thing progress from Catelyn's perspective. And so what happens is, like, throughout the entire time, Kat is running back through her head, like, all the different Westerling family lines and who married what, and she's basically, like, she's kind of putting it together in their head that, like, their intentions might not be all pure here, but by the time she puts two and two together, it's too late. The Red Wedding happens. So that's what kind of adds a little bit more intrigue and mystery there. But
that would have been interesting to give Catelyn sort of like a Sherlock Holmes investigation over season 2 and 3.
Especially since Catelyn kind of gets taken down a peg, where she basically gets stripped entirely of her power once she ultimately makes the decision to release Jaime. Not to mention the fact that with the death of her father and the introduction of her extended family in season 3, she's kind of just left to like sit there and mourn until she inevitably dies. It really is kind of a takedown, because even though the extent to me of her inclusion in the story really dies out after this season, she still like had like a lot of like intrigue area, and it still obviously was extremely tragic when she ultimately met her end in the books. But I don't know. It was just always something that like was of interest to me as far as kind of like the Talisa character goes, because in my opinion, again, not one of the stronger characters just in general. And what's it called? Because she was upgraded to main cast member status for the next season.
Yeah, well, I guess, I don't know. You kill some characters off, you need to up them for main event status.
True.
But the most part, I would say, whenever you're creating a story for television, you have to condense the book into the new format. And, I think one of the things that they're brilliant at is doing this editing where it's like, we just need to give you enough about this character. We can't overcomplicate it. It's really just Robb marries her that leads to his demise. Right. That's all she is. Any of the scenes that they write are really just to help with the illusion to get you from, he made a mistake to what the actual impact of that mistake is.
Yes.
And I think they do a pretty good job of sticking to what needed to actually be on screen.
Yes, absolutely. So let's get into it. Let's get into the main storylines of this episode. First up, King's Landing. Starts with a pretty gruesome opening in King's Landing for a myriad of different reasons. So it transitions.
Okay, let's just talk about Joffrey.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I know.
Going to Torture City.
Your favorite character this season, Joffrey. You've talked quite a lot about him.
Man, it's okay. So obviously Robb wins this battle, and then Joffrey's got something to say about it, and he has his crossbow now, and he's just like cranking
that crossbow,
and he's holding it right at Sansa.
That crossbow more than any of both of his swords.
Yeah, hey, I wish he actually had like maybe one cool scene where he actually used the crossbow. Like maybe they should have done like a hunt scene.
Oh well, like, funny you mentioned that. And it's funny that we have this particular scene in this episode because that's almost foreshadowing for what comes next season when Roz inevitably meets her end.
Okay, but that's still like a
ways away.
That's a ways away, but that's also like a post-mortem scene. It just cuts to the aftermath. Like if he went on a hunt or something and took down a wild boar.
Joffrey going on a hunt? Who is he? Robert?
Hey, I don't know, man. That might be interesting. Obviously it's out of character, but what else is he gonna do with a crossbow? Like no one wants to see him actually. No one wants to see him actually torturing someone with a crossbow.
But he just Joffrey just makes that a thing. He has gotten to the point now where he is so in his own head as far as what kind of a king he is that he's just gonna blatantly threaten Sansa in front of the entire court of people. I'm like, wow. So this is the type of king he is. Like, cool.
Yeah. Well, Joffrey's real sort of idea is that if he's just ruthless towards everybody will fear him, which means they'll just follow him. So he believes in the whole fear, is what gets people to stay, in line. And that's something that, Tywin has probably utilized, for the Lannister family. So, but like Joffrey's so young that he doesn't really understand what fear is, or how to use fear in that way to keep people in line. Right. So his idea of fear is just like chop off Ned's head. Let's rip Sansa's dress apart. Let's do all this like stuff that's like really grotesque, and it's not working for Joffrey at all.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, too, especially since we see, obviously, the stark contrast in this episode alone between Joffrey and Tywin with how they handle things, right? Where Joffrey delights in the torture and just wants to do it over and over. The torture is brought up quite frequently in this episode. I just realized that. First with Roose, and then with Joffrey, and then later on, obviously, at Harrenhal. Meanwhile, when Tywin gets to Harrenhal and sees, obviously, all these prisoners getting tortured, he's like, are we so like stock full of labor so we can't use these prisoners? It's like he understands the value of mercy, and that's part of what makes him so feared, versus Joffrey just wants to delight in it just by making everyone just kind of his playthings almost. But ultimately, Tyrion quite literally comes in at the last minute to save the day, and even though his time in this episode is brief, it is once again memorable. I said so last episode was his Emmy reel, but this episode, like just the moment that he has with Joffrey, it's like the only thing that quite tops it is obviously in 2 episodes when he gets to belt him across the face like 3 times. But yeah. He obviously, he berates Joffrey. He says, "Wow, so you're doing this like in front of a whole court of people, and she's supposed to be your queen, and this is how you're treating her. Like you're not setting right. This is all about image, right? And right now, image-wise, the Lannisters are not looking so good. Stannis is doing us no favors, right? And so you've got to start acting up as far as that goes. Then of course, Meryn is he's like the king can do what he likes, and Tyrion's like the mad.
Well, actually, actually,
did what he
Joffrey
liked.
says that, right? You know,
Right, yeah,
Joffrey's like,
Joffrey
I
says
can
the
do
king-
whatever I want.
Yep,
and-
Joffrey basically says he can do whatever he wants. Tyrion's like, the Mad King did as he wanted. Has your Uncle Jamie ever told you what happened to him? Kind of trying to reinforce and educate his nephew that a king quite literally doing whatever he wishes usually does not work out well for him in a long run. And of course, we have this awesome
Yeah, how dare
line,
you? How dare you threaten the liege?
right? How no one threatens the king. And then Tyrion's like, I'm not threatening him. I'm educating my nephew. Bronn, the next time he speaks, kill him. Just incredible.
Yeah,
Just
and
incredible.
and basically Tyrion makes a point of saying, hey, you know, there's a difference between education and a threat. Like
Right.
you just saw me threaten you. You know, so
Yes.
again, it's Tyrion having that wit, or you know, being perceived to have that wit in this scene, to really outrival, you know, his family members, and in this case, Joffrey. But I think it's Bronn, right? Bronn comes up with the idea, like, hey,
Yes.
Joffrey might need a little R&R.
Yeah, to say the least, and that does not go well at all because
Yeah, so and
Not
Bronn,
at
you
all.
know, Bronn being a sellsword and the guy that basically, you know, would be hanging out in a tavern or a brothel and are both, basically is like, hey, why don't you pay for some ladies to visit Joffrey and allow him to sort of forget being a king for the evening and enjoy, you know,
get some much needed relief.
exactly. So, so Roz, and unfortunately I don't remember the
Yeah,
other
another prostitute. I don't think she ever
you know,
has a name.
act-
I
yeah.
checked too in the what's called in the like the Amazon where
Yeah,
it has the cast members.
yeah.
Nothing. She didn't have a name. I think she just said like unnamed prostitute or something like that.
Yes, well, I don't think the actor shows up again in the show, right? Maybe
I
one
don't
more
believe so. I
time,
don't-
like
I
as
don't
a
believe
background.
I don't believe so.
But yeah, so Roz and you know, another character are there and sort of, you know, quickly come on to Joffrey and let him know that Tyrion sent us, you know, to you know, have a good evening. And Joffrey's like, Tyrion sent you, and instead of just relaxing and enjoying a decent night, he decides to crank up his crossbow, you know, and intimidate Roz into basically beating
This other
the
poor
other
prostitute to
woman.
within an inch of her life, and then basically tells her, he's like, yes, you will go back to him and you will tell him exactly what it is that you've done, because he wants him to see that like Tyrion doesn't have that, like he has just as much control over Tyrion as Tyrion perceives to have over him. And it's kind of like this really kind of fucked up balancing act where it's like, okay, where Joffrey is once again showing to Tyrion, he showed it to Cersei, and now he's showing it to Tyrion that like, yeah, I can do what I want and you best watch out.
Well, yeah, it's a weird threat because like he's just really showing how dangerous he is, and
Right.
and reckless danger. You know, not like actual like, you know, I'll craft something and get you in your sleep, you know, type of thing. It's more like, oh my god, like I give him, you know, this gift.
I give him this
You
gift.
know, and basically instead of, you know, what is expected, which is having a night of pleasure with these two women, he basically decides to beat one of them.
Yep.
Or have the other one beat her. And it's like, that's just reckless. Like, what it says, you're you know, you do have this like anger sort of, and you have this like power dynamic going on, but you know, Tyrion, like, it's weird that they don't show the reaction, because Tyrion would just be like probably outright disgusted about Joffrey and just not think he's legitimately can rule a kingdom. You know, it's like, what else is Tyrion to think
He even admits
in
it
response to that?
He even admits in the next episode that the king is beyond our help, and he kind of like just gives up on trying to coach Joffrey in any way, shape, or form, and he kind of refocuses his efforts on just the defense of the city, especially after the events of what happened between the end of this episode and the next. But there's only one other major scene in King's Landing that takes place, which is of course Tyrion like blackmailing Lancel into becoming his spy, which is just that whole scene is just amazing.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. Like, Lancel comes in trying to maintain this buff, gruff attitude, trying to demand. He's like, your sister demands that you release Pycelle, and Tyrion, of course, Tyrion doesn't even have to try with this one. Like Tyrion like had to expend like a little bit of effort with Pycelle, but like with this guy, he's like, he knows, he's like, yeah, Lancel ain't worth shit. I mean, like, he kind of just walks him right into just admitting that he's having sex with Cersei, and then basically says it's like, oh, I'm gonna go go tell Joffrey. It's like, oh, save it for Joffrey. He does love a good grovel. And then he basically just like blackmails him and says, okay, now you're gonna tell me everything that Cersei does, and it's just incredible. Just everything.
Yeah, it's really bizarre to me. Like Jaime gets captured, and oh hey, here's cousin Lysel. You know, let's just
Also,
Lancel,
I will say Robert Baratheon was spot on with his take on Lancel. Lancel Lannister. God, what a stupid name.
Yeah,
God, I miss Robert.
That was a good scene. But like, you know, it's just really bizarre. Like Cersei's just going around finding some cousin that she can replace Jaime with. Yeah. And you know,
there's a lot of ladder rungs between Jaime and Lancel Lannister. Like it's even there in the name.
Well, yeah, but I think it's one of those things where she's just like, hey, you know, I just need some comfort, I guess, you know, in this really, you know, and I guess the stress of having Joffrey, who's like a terrible son, and not running the kingdom, you know, it kind of makes sense in terms of like, you know, as the show goes on, like Cersei really is, you know, starts to lose it and, you know, complain about like how hard it is to actually, you know, rule. And, you know, she is in that sort of position with, you know, early in the first season, Robert, where she is like, you know, one of two people ruling the kingdom. And then she just remains there with Joffrey and, you know, Tomlin and basically throughout. What, you know?
Sorry, it's Tommen, but you said
Tommen. Yeah, whatever. It's Tommen. But you know, I'm getting the names a little messed up. But you know, basically, she is like maintaining the power and maintaining, you know, basically the king under the Lannister banner, and it's hard work. You know, it's not something that is really an easy task for her to take. You know, she is playing the Game of Thrones at a very high level, and you know, it's okay. So, you know, Lancel just is one of those, you know, pleasures that she takes to de-stress, I guess. You know,
it's phrasing. It just makes it even funnier. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a weird storyline because it's just some random cousin that they have, and
but it ends up obviously back to bite her in the ass, obviously, in the worst way possible.
But like
season 5,
they don't really focus the show on, you know, Jaime being away and she has to rely on someone, even if it's like not someone that she really cares about. Like, you know, obviously Robert said, "Oh, what a dumb name." It's like she doesn't really care about him. She probably just chose him as like sort of a daft, you know, person and just figured he could keep a secret.
Yes.
You know, so it's one of those things where I wish, you know, in this particular storyline, it wasn't just sort of, you know, Tyrion getting back at her and that's it. You know, I wish there was a little more depth into Cersei, like, you know, of why she's doing this, or like, you know, seeing a little more desperation of, you know, Jaime not being there. Like, you know, obviously we get the dialogue scenes later on when Jaime returns in the later seasons, you know, where it's like, you weren't there and I had to deal with this stuff and blah, blah, blah. But we don't necessarily see it, you know, as Jaime's absent. It's sort of just alluded to, which, you know, it's fine.
Right,
but
especially
it
because
might be...
Jaime has so little screen time in this whole season because he's a prisoner for most of it.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those things where I think putting it more on screen would have been awesome in season 2. Just seeing, you know, Cersei really, you know, missing Jaime, really struggling to sort of hold the kingdom together. There's like only a couple scenes where she just like starts freaking out and yelling at Tyrion, and that's about it. You know, she really is not like the Cersei of the later seasons where she commands a lot of the episodes.
Right. And that was kind of exactly the way that it was in the books, almost by design, where the whole kind of thing, that way that Martin like kind of, you know, ramped it up, is that between Clash of Kings and Storm of Swords, there was so much that happened, and then he gets all these characters out of the way at the end of Storm of Swords, between the Red Wedding, Joffrey's wedding, the Mountain, you know, the Mountain of the Viper trial, you know, all of that happening. So then when the dust settles in Feast for Crows and Dance of Dragons, it is Cersei for the first time on her own. And again, he has this by design where she spent so much of her time just dealing with all these people that she seemingly doesn't like and can't stand and just irritate her. And then when she finally actually has a little bit of power, she just goes about it in the worst way possible. You know, it's almost, she's set up as this very tragic character, you know, where when she finally has an iota of control, she just almost doesn't know what to do with it ultimately. And the problem is that again, it makes her like a thankless character at first, and so as a result, it kind of, you know, forces her to be in all these scenes with everyone else, kind of depending off of the reactions of everyone else, and kind of going by this exposition, you know, to be informed of stuff about her. And I guess that's what makes season 5 so refreshing as far as she goes, because that's the first season where we're finally we're in her head, we're in her shoes, you know, we're finally seeing how things are going from her perspective, you know. But for now, we're unfortunately relegated to only hearing about, you know, about her from other sources. And I definitely will, but in a way it almost kind of works to its benefit, because she's built up as such this like demonstrative force that when and then when we finally see her like having a chance to throw it out, it's like, oh, okay, so this is what Cersei Lannister ultimately amounts to. But one more storyline before we get to the main
Yeah, well, it's basically, you already talked about it, when Tywin returns home,
yes,
right, to his keep.
Harrenhal.
Yeah, so that's sort of the end of the storyline, but basically he finds Gendry in the torture chair.
Yes.
And Arya, you know, the girl dressed as a boy, you know, in the pen, you know, whatever. And then, you know, so he comes and he's like, you know, these people have trades, you know, and he looks at Gendry in the chair and he's like, what do you do? You know, do you have a trade? And he's like, a smith. And Tywin like lights up. He's like, what the fuck?
He's like, wow. He literally he looks at Polliver,
yeah.
as Polliver's trying to like smack around Arya, and he's like, you'll do no such thing, you idiot. Besides, that's not a boy, that's a girl. And he's like, clearly, it's almost like it's almost, and then when Arya explains why she's disguised as a boy, he's like smart. It's the beginning of like probably one of my like favorite sub arcs that just doesn't get talked about enough in the entire of the show, which is the back and forth between Arya and Tywin when he makes her his cupbearer, because it's almost like he, without knowing who she is the entire time, like he almost grows to have this, like they almost grow to like kind of have this mutual admiration for each other, which in a weird way, it's
I love the part, like you brought it up, but you kind of skipped over it a little bit. Like when, you know, it's like, oh, very smart, unlike this lot here.
Unlike this lot.
Yeah, and it's like you just see the look on the face of the soldiers, like, oh, we disappointed him again. Yeah. You know, it's a really funny scene.
Having to deal with a bunch of disappointed kids, but yeah, it's hilarious. Like they get to Harrenhal, which of course has this rich, crazy history behind it that we'll get into in the later episodes. But it's essentially this giant smoldering ruin that in the center of the realm that for whatever reason has this massive value because of kind of, I guess, based on where it is location wise. But like it starts off, Arya and the prisoners are there. They're watching this guy named the Tickler torture all these people, you know, including this one poor guy. They're basically trying to learn the location of the Brotherhood without banners, which we don't really know about. This is the first time that we really hear about them, and they're kind of built up, and then until we finally meet them in the next season and kind of learn what their intentions are. But they're basically, from what we've heard, this kind of rebel band that's giving the Lannister forces in the Riverland some trouble. But of course, this is where Arya starts reciting her list of names, obviously to herself, that she learned from Yoren in the last episode. And then, of course, when it's Gendry's turn to be tortured, after they unfortunately see the results of what happens with the boy that they were torturing the day before, when they are literally nailing his head on a pike.
Yeah, what a torture. This is all about torture, this episode.
Is obsessed
you know?
with torture. It's
like,
really weird.
Okay, so they put the guy in the chair, and then they have a bunch of hungry rats in the metal bucket.
Yes.
And they put it on his stomach. And then they take a torch and they, you know, heat up the end of the bucket.
Right. It's in order to get the rat to, like, chew through his stomach. It's a torture technique I actually learned from the Fast and the Furious franchise. I will have you know, because they do it the torture sequence very similar to this in the second movie, Too Fast, Too Furious. Man, that franchise was
so it was that torture was making the rounds. You know, in Hollywood.
In Hollywood, yeah.
You know, during that time period. But the main thing is, you know, it's. That guy endured that all day, and then he just got his head on a spike, and it's like, just imagine the amount of fear everyone in that pit. There's like a scene where a woman's like, "Please, just a scrap of bread." Yeah, and he like, I believe she gets slapped down.
Where the woman is like listening to the screaming, and she's like, "That's my son. It was my sister the day before." and my husband the day before that. And he's like, he lets him go. And then Gendry's like, he lets them go afterwards, right? And I almost, like, the woman didn't need to give any reaction, but I almost feel like just everyone almost like, or Hot Pie said it, but it's almost like everyone, like, just should have turned around and been like, did you look around? You see where you are right now? Like, but I'll definitely say that, like, like, again, this is, again, just another setup storyline. But the one thing I will say is, as far as I remember these sequences from the book, like the sequences in the Riverlands where we actually, like, saw the war up close and personal, right? First with Arya, and then obviously is that, you know, was Brienne was bringing Jaime to King's Landing in book 3, and then obviously when she's going on her journey to find Sansa in book 4, like you have these long sequences that are this vivid graphic depiction of all of this awful torture that's kind of like supposed to be reminiscent of like the Black Plague, whereas like people that are like barely grasping onto life, even though they're like have limbs falling off and like maggots eating them from the inside out. It's like, it's very, very gruesome stuff. And like, I think this episode, they definitely started to shy away from that stuff as time went on, but I definitely think they did a really good job of like portraying that in the early seasons, especially since, because like the budget kind of restricted them from being able to do obviously the more grander, more extravagant stuff. So like, as far as like getting really in and down with the dirt like that, I think they did a really good job.
Yeah, I also think it does a really good job. Like, you look at the scene at the beginning of the episode with Robb, and it's like he has medics in there healing people, and there's really just talk about strategy and no, I'm not going to torture people. And then you know, halfway through the episode, you get to Tywin coming into town, and it's like the most horrific torture that you've ever seen on screen. And he's just like, oh, you know, that's enough. Like let's put some of these people to work.
Let's pump the brakes there. Actually,
like he knew, he knew what was happening when he was away. He didn't, right. You know, he kind of lets it happen up to a certain point. You know, and that goes to my earlier point where Tywin knows how to use fear. You know, it's like he goes in there, he has them sort of torture a few people, you know, and then he basically says, oh, hey, you know, let's put these people to work. And then it's like, oh, well, he kind of saved us, you know, but he has the ability to torture us, but he lets us, you know, work. He lets us live. And so that's like Tywin using that, you know, fear to his advantage and putting people in line, something that Joffrey really is not there to witness, and Joffrey really doesn't understand how to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting also kind of, again, how Tywin recognizes, I'm constantly in this weird conundrum with Tywin Lannister, where on one hand, right, he's this brutal leader that, you know, seeks to sublimate and gain control over everything with power, but then you have these, like, little brief moments where it's like, yeah, would he be the worst ruler? Because, like, he has these brief moments of fairness, right? He really only responds with violence when people provoke him, obviously. Like, he started this whole war as a result of, you know, his son, who he didn't even really like that much, being captured, and he, like, grants mercy to people who he knows that they're not going to get anything out of them about the Brotherhood. So ultimately he so he grants like this moment of mercy ultimately, and ends up kind of giving all these people a chance to, like, you know, just live again. So it's like, it's one of it's one of those moments that we constantly find ourselves in, where it's like, oh man, this guy is such a tyrant, he's so awful, and then you meet him and he's like, well, he's not that bad of a guy, but he's clearly that guy who's like, yeah, if you cross him, he will destroy you. And not only that, he will destroy you and any trace of your name, you know? Obviously, we'll get to it in a later episode, but the reason why the song is entitled The Reigns of Castamere is because it's what happens when the Rain family attempted to rise up against Tywin Lannister. Because that's all that was left. There wasn't even any trace of their castle for them to for there to be remembered, because that's what happens when you cross Tywin Lannister ultimately. So it's a good scene, it's a good setup sequence, it's a good kind of reinforcement. You know, again, playing off of what Arya learned last episode, and kind of, again, another like subtle kind of a reintroduction to the might that is Tywin Lannister, and kind of how he acted really in these early seasons as like this kind of looming overall force before he really started to take more of a direct play in the action in the next 2 seasons. But now we get to the main storyline, and oh man, I don't know about you, Pat, but everything that happens in this main storyline is dynamite, just from the minute that it happens. So we're in the Stormlands, we're in Renly Baratheon's tent. Littlefinger arrives to negotiate with them. Tyrion obviously sending him there in order to attempt to get some semblance of alliance with Catelyn Stark. Obviously, he attempts to negotiate with Renly. Renly is not having it. Renly does not like the fact that Littlefinger is here, obviously, and he immediately detects, like, oh, you're trying to save your own skin because you know that when I march on King's Landing, I'm gonna take it and demolish the thing. And so Littlefinger kind of realizes he's getting nowhere with Renly. Then he visits Cat. Cat obviously immediately accuses him of betraying Ned, saying that like the minute that you get half a chance, you betrayed him, and I trusted you to look after him. Which I'm like, again, just playing into that dutiful childhood connection.
It's a great scene. Like he's literally like, Catelyn, we have a second chance. Like we could get together. Like he's really.
We have this.
He's really pushing for it.
Wow. I'm like, wow. Like the cojones on this guy. Like, man, I really think Littlefinger's. You know what the problem is? Littlefinger had such a great introduction in season 1 that I keep forgetting about how awesome he was in season 2. Like season 2, like man, season 2 Littlefinger is giving season 1 Littlefinger a run for his money. Just as far as like, man, there are no boundaries to.
In this scene, he does everything right. He really is genuine about his love for her and trying to like. This is his motivation. He wears that on his face, like this is the reason why I'm here, this is why I'm doing it, so Tyrion sent the right person for this deception because he could just rely, it's instead of like, the greatest lies are the truth, so he just exaggerates the truth and sort of blinds her to what he's doing, and he convinces her, by sort of giving Ned Stark's bones to her. This is sort of starts the ball rolling in her mind. Like maybe I should release Jaime on the side,
right.
To get my daughters back. And I think this is one of this is a really good scene that really shows this, a quite clever deception at work.
Absolutely. And then, of course, it ends with he has one more character interaction, right? And it shows he gets the cat, ultimately, because he obviously plays to her emotions, obviously, with the girls, and then presents Ned's bones, obviously, as a token of Tyrion's goodwill, right? The idea that, okay, yeah, it's at the very least, we're going to give you this as far as your list of demands.
So he gives the bones, and he's like, hey, you want to get a ale at the tavern? It's like, it's really...
Want to literally go on a date over your dead husband's body? Like...
It's he really is pushing
it up,
the whole time.
And then he has one more interaction, obviously the first of his couple interactions with Marjorie Tyrell, which kind of, again, this is where all the seeds are laid for, like, kind of what leads to later on in the season where Tyrion's like, okay, if you remove Renly, right? He made his play with Catelyn, obviously for Jaime, right? But then he notices, he's like, okay, so Renly himself is a problem, but Renly's forces might prove to actually be, somewhat of an ally. So he starts to like probe around with Marjorie Tyrell, because again, he probably doesn't know who this woman is, but he notices definitely that she's beautiful, which obviously catches his eye, but also starts to understand that like, she's a little bit, this girl is a little bit smarter for her own good, and she might be, because he knows Loras Tyrell is not the future of House Tyrell. He knows that Loras is a complete joke. He was even making jokes with Renly last season about it. But he kind of starts to gauge Marjorie a little bit, and even though Marjorie fires right back at him, is like, yeah, I'm not having anything having to do with you. My husband is my lord, and I do his bidding, no matter what rumors you may have heard. But Littlefinger starts to see this like, okay, there may be an opening here, But of course, it's inevitable, because before Renly has a chance to march on King's Landing, he unfortunately has to deal with Stannis. Oh, Stannis. Stannis really is, the more and more I realize, just kind of what's it called, like kink in the armor, like the monkey in the wrench, kind of, to quote Bruce Willis from Die Hard, in this entire season, because directly because of Stannis, Renly is taken off the board completely, robbing the North of any sort of ally, right? He ultimately ends up becoming the foe that the Lannisters have to deal with when he eventually makes his march on Blackwater, and not to mention the fact that again, he completely kind of cements himself as like his own player. Like he officially says, he's like, none of you are on my side unless you declare your loyalty directly to me. I am on my own, and I am coming for this, and no one is getting in my way. Because the negotiation scene that happens here next between Renly and Stannis, I think, is really interesting, where Renly is kind of just poking fun at him, not really taking him seriously and everything, and Stannis is like trying to like take him seriously for all intents and purposes, and kind of saying, like, I would say stop this.
Yeah, I would say Stannis gives a really good offer. He's like, listen, kneel to me. I'll name you my heir, basically until I have a son that's born. And, we'll basically take over the kingdoms and put things back in our family and make sure that the rightful king is there. And, it's like Renly really just wants to be king. And that's the problem here, is he's not really thinking, hey, what's best for our, me, right. What's best for the family, he's really thinking just for himself, right. Like in terms of like, I want to be king, and therefore I'm just going to take it. And I don't care about my brother, because, Stannis is someone that, is sort of a little bit of a curmudgeon. So like he never really, I guess, got too many friends. He doesn't have that many bannermen, I suspect. And so therefore his forces are not as overwhelming as Renly's. And that's really what this is all about, is like Stannis, has the right to the throne, but he doesn't necessarily have the troops, and that's why he wants Renly to sort of bend the knee to him.
That's why he needs Renly's forces. And this negotiation, like I said, Catelyn literally says, it's like, are you kidding? She even says in her own words, like, are you kidding me? You two are brothers. You two should be helping each other out. But it's ultimately a battle of the egos, because again, you're right, Stannis is the rightful heir, and Stannis has the best claim. But, and he even says, the Iron Throne is his by rights. And he even says, he's like, Lady Stark, I'm a little bit confused to see you here because your husband was a supporter of my claim, And unfortunately, it's a matter of Stannis has the claim, but he doesn't have the troops. Renly has the troops, but he doesn't have the claim. If they kind of were able to come to this agreement, right, they would be a pretty damn powerful force to be reckoned with, The problem is that
they should have been able to, right? Because look at it. Like, if they took over the kingdoms and it was, Stannis was the king, Renly would have, a lot more. He would be a lot
more power and a lot more control than he ever did under Robert, really. Because Robert even said last season, Robert really didn't like any of his brothers. But unfortunately, it's all for naught. Renly cannot get out of his own way, and Renly kind of grits and bares his teeth by saying, yeah, the whole realm denies it. And what's it called? And when Stannis says, you think a couple of cloths will make you king? And he's like, no, but the men holding those cloths will. It's like Renly cannot get out of his own way, and it's ultimately leading him down a path that he unfortunately cannot come back from, because unfortunately Stannis is also.
Well, I do think the whole thing where Renly sort of dismisses Stannis's claim and says the whole realm dismisses it is very interesting, because we remember the Ravens were sent out and everybody knew about these sort of incest and the fact that Joffrey is not the actual legitimate heir. Like, everybody knows about this. And the fact is, it's very interesting to see that the Lannisters have been able to dispel this. And really, where Renly says, across the realm, old and young, newborn babies, like, no one wants you as the king. And really, they reject your claim. It's true. Like, no one generally wants Stannis there, and they don't believe, Ned Stark's, basically discovery that's public and in the open. So there might be some small minority that believes it, but for the most part, the Lannisters were able to sort of, quell that blow that Ned Stark tried to inflict on them.
Yeah, and ultimately, like I said, it's all for naught, because Stannis, obviously, on his ship has Davos Seaworth. Remember his smuggling days. There's some really choice words there where he kind of interrogates him about his smuggling days, and a little bit of exposition in order to kind of but to bring back and refresh us on why Stannis entrusts Davos so much, even though he and why Davos kind of follows him, because again, he's just, but he is fair, and he has Davos smuggled Melisandre ashore in order to kind of, again, it's very clever how they shoot it, where they only shoot Melisandre, the character specifically, from either wides or close-ups, like of the top of her body, and so you ultimately don't see that she is pregnant. And so, of course, when Davos smuggles her ashore, she's asking him some very choice questions about his wife and everything. And she does that thing again that she does a couple times throughout the show, where she brings up the idea of seduction. Only with Davos, she doesn't actually try to seduce him before she reveals ultimately her naked body, and she gives birth to the shadow baby. And that's how the episode ends, which brings us into our focus character segment, Melisandre. Which, Pat, I'm actually interested in this. Like, what is your take on just the character of Melisandre, what she represented? Because I'll admit, she was a character that for a long time kind of confused me as far as her involvement here. Again, I was really confused, where I'm like, okay, so we're meeting Stannis, the third Baratheon brother, and he's got this red priest, like that, devotee that he's following, that is kind of, for lack of a better word, his muse, his sage, that is dictate, his prophet almost. And I'm like, okay, I've seen this in like stories before, but like, where is this going ultimately?
Yeah, well, I feel like the introduction to Stannis is linked with the introduction to Melisandre, and it's all about the atmosphere, right? Sort of this almost like hermit king who decides to take on a new religion because somehow that's going to give him extra power to take the throne. There's something culty about it that really does work here, and it's like we get to see some cool stuff, like the gentleman that tries to poison her, but he sacrifices himself, and the poison doesn't have any impact on her. Like, we're in the early days of Melisandre at this point, and for the most part, it's like she does have power, granted by the Lord of Light, but like, what really is the Lord of Light's power? It's how do these things come about? There's a big mystery going on, and I really think that's what Melisandre's character serves, really, for a good portion of the series.
Yeah, it's a very large source of mystery, right? It kind of brings us also, we're crossing it over again with our gotcha first segment with the Red Priestesses, right? Where the whole thing about them is no one really knows kind of a whole lot as far as the origin, right? They're obviously in the clergy of the faith of R'hllor, the Lord of Light, obviously from the Shadowlands of Ashai, right? They're kind of known for the red clothing that they wear. They appear to be really just zealous proselytizers, because we see obviously after season 4, throughout season 5, when Tyrion is journeying throughout Essos, he sees the Red Priests all over Essos kind of preaching the name of Daenerys, since she's quite literally the dragon reborn, right? And obviously the whole thing, right, is that R'hllor is supposedly, what's it called? The being of light, of warmth in the universe, and that his ultimate enemy is the Great Other, So it's interesting kind of where, obviously, the dragons are supposed to be this one kind of element of fire in the never-ending fight between ice and fire against, the inevitable kind of coming of the White Walkers. But it's interesting now to see, like, this other aspect, especially since, because, again, of all of the religions that are introduced within Westeros, aside from the Faceless Men, which, again, the extent of their sorcery, I think, is very limited, but the Red Priestesses, like, have a full-on variety of what's it called, of powers at their hands. Obviously, again, some examples: the ability to see poison, the ability to never get cold, the ability to last for like hundreds upon thousands of years, but under the guise of still remaining young and vibrant. In this case, the ability to produce shadow assassins. Throughout the show, again, it's the early kind of seeds being dropped of magic existing in this world without it necessarily focusing on it. And even though ultimately, as we see in the next episode, it's used as a means of a technique of Stannis in order to seize control of Renly's forces without actually having to engage him in open battlefield. It's interesting to me kind of how Stannis is once again kind of, and by proxy, Melisandre are kind of getting around this idea of honor, where we obviously, again, that kind of is contrasting him from Ned Stark, where, again, kind of Stannis is almost introduced as like the Ned Stark substitute in a way where it's like, okay, this is what Ned would have done if he were like kind of isolated from everything but doing everything right, but Stannis, as we know, is obviously willing to bend or break the rules in order to get his way,
Yeah, I forgot what Stannis says to Davos. He says, Davos like pleads like this is not the way to do it, and then Stannis says, wars aren't won,
right,
without these types of deceptions. I forgot how they phrase it, but like, for the most part, it's like,
no, he says surely there's a more honorable way to do it, and he's like, honor doesn't win wars or something.
Yeah,
like that.
Exactly. That's and but Stannis like understands, how to fight wars, right? That's part of his myth leading up to his introduction, is that he is someone that really knows,
very experienced battle commander.
Yeah, how to win, and so he knows when to deploy deception, and this is one of those cases where Melisandre has sort of seduced him. The promise to give him a son. It's going to be a shadow baby thing. But I don't even know how, just trust me. Is that what she said? Just just trust me.
Just go with it. This will totally work out.
How much does Stannis know about the giving birth to a shadow, the shadow floating?
Clearly not that much. I think
into the area.
That's something that I always wondered. It's like, did he know like the extent of what his seed, for lack of a better word, would be accomplishing in this instance? Because, and the other crazy thing too is this is another storyline where they completely like change it from the books, because in the books also you have you have also the fact that Renly has Edric Storm, which is another bastard of Robert's that was outside of King's Landing, who in the show does not exist, and elements of his character were mixed with Gendry that we see in season 3, obviously, where Stannis actually pulls another play like this. First he has Renly killed, then he has this Maester who's looking over Storm's End, who is keeping this bastard who he wants under his protection, and then he deploys the same shadow assassin thing in order to kill him there, So they obviously mix that into one, but Obviously, we see kind of the extent of that continue into next episode, but I think it's interesting kind of how Stannis makes this play without kind of really knowing what's going on. He just knows that, like, yeah, Melisandre is going to handle this, and then at the end of the day, I'll have one less enemy on the field, you know? But he obviously does deal with it, because at the end of the season, we see him, like, come into, like, personal blows with it, where he, like, kind of admits he's like, I killed my brother in order to get this, and I didn't even win. Because the sad fact is that at the end of the day is that Stannis is doing all this, and Melisandre is helping him do all this stuff, but he loses at the end, and the sad fact is that he kind of never recovers from Blackwater, from his loss in the Blackwater. So,
yeah, I would say, you know, tracking Stannis throughout the rest of the show and the Lord of Light, like when you get something from the Lord of Light, it's almost
comes with
like
a heavy price.
Yeah, it's a heavy price, but it's also like, you know, you might not necessarily get everything that you wished for. You know, you're only going to get certain things. And you know, it's yeah, you got your wish. You got Renly's army, and as we'll see later in the season, he can use that to attack. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like, the Lord of Light is not guaranteeing that he could win.
Right, exactly. And that's ultimately where we end our episode. The only thing left that we have to do is, of course, you guys know it, it's a staple of it, the death count of the episode. We had 2 deaths this episode, which is those poor Lannister guards at the beginning who got killed by who were killed by Grey Wind. Of course, R.I.P. that guy who did the fart joke. And then, of course, the guy that the tickler had tortured, whose head we saw later being nailed on the spike. Those are our 2 deaths.
Yeah, I think a few hundred extras were probably killed. In that. But
again, we already talked about our stance on battles and all the people who die in battles. So we're gonna leave it at that. And that was ultimately our next episode of Game of Thrones, Talkin Thrones, Garden of Bones. A lot of bones, a lot of owns going on here just in general. We'll be back next week.
You would think we would have talked more about Dany for an episode that's named after her.
Oh man, we're just gonna have more of her. Now she's gonna be wandering around the city instead of in a car, instead of in the desert. So at the very least, that'll be somewhat better. But people, let us know your thoughts on this episode in the comment section below. Be sure to keep tuning in every Sunday for our continuing coverage of this show. We're only getting started. We're almost at the halfway point, Pat. Next week, halfway point of season 2. Then we got another 5 episodes after that. It's crazy. We are banging these out ultimately. Where can the good people find you?
Listen, basically here on Talkin TV, that's where I am right now. I do have an Instagram at Patrick W. Huber. Hey, maybe I'll post there. I keep saying I will. I take photos, but I never transfer them to my phone. So I need to get on this. I need to just get the workflow going and get it done.
Yes, and you can find me right here on the Talkin TV channel, Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast, where I post every single day, sometimes twice a day. Also, if you guys click the subscribe button below, click the bell button next to it, leave a comment down below, you'd be helping out the channel tremendously. Like I said, new episodes of Talkin Thrones uploaded every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you guys once again for tuning in. Follow me on my personal social medias at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. We'll catch you guys next week. 12 seasons in a short film. And watch more fucking movies.
Yeah, get tortured less. You know? Like, that's my advice.
And watch more Game of Thrones. We'll see you guys next time.